Welcome back to the Alibi Club, where every mystery is a file waiting to be reopened. Tonight's case takes us deep into the Bavarian countryside, to a quiet farmstead in 1922 that still whispers with blood and unanswered questions. This isn't just a crime story, it's a legend, one that has haunted detectives, historians, and locals for more than a century. The place was called Hinterkaifeck, an isolated farmhouse, half a mile from its nearest neighbors. On the surface, it was like any other German homestead of the time, fields to plow, animals to tend, and a family working hard to survive. But beneath that ordinary surface lay something darker. Strange footprints appeared in the snow, voices were heard in the attic, keys went missing, and 6 people, the family and their maid, confided to neighbors that they felt something wasn't right. Then came March 31st, 1922. By the time neighbors checked the farmhouse days later, they found a scene so gruesome, it would make even seasoned detectives shiver. 6 bodies, slaughtered with a mattock, hidden beneath hay in the barn, and blankets in the house. The family's dog barking wildly, the livestock unfed, and silence hanging heavy over a house that seemed to keep its secrets even in death. So was this a brutal robbery, a family feud, or something far stranger? Tonight, we reopen the file on the Hinterkaifeck Murders, a farmhouse full of secrets that refuses to tell its truth. Every mystery begins not with the crime itself, but with the setting, the stage where shadows gather before the curtain rises. To understand the Hinterkaifeck Murders, we first have to step back into the Bavarian countryside of the early 1920s, into a farmhouse that seemed ordinary to the world, but whispered unease to those who lived within. The farm lay about a mile outside the small village of Gruber, in Upper Bavaria, Germany. Remote, isolated, and surrounded by dense woodland, Hinterkaifeck was the kind of place where silence wasn't peaceful, it was heavy. A dirt track connected it to the nearest road, but neighbors were far enough away that a cry for help might never be heard. In 1922, this isolation meant vulnerability. If something happened out here, it could stay hidden for days. The family who lived at Hinterkaifeck was as complicated as the farm itself. At its head was Andreas Gruber, 63 years old, a stern and unpopular man. By all accounts, Andreas was harsh, quick-tempered, and not well liked in the community. He had a reputation for cruelty, both in business and at home. Some neighbors avoided him entirely. His wife Cecilia, 72, was quieter, but endured her husband's domineering presence. Together they had raised children, but only one remained in the household, their daughter Victoria Gabriel, 35. Victoria was a widow, her husband had died in World War I, leaving her to raise their 2 children, little Cecilia, age 7, and Joseph, just 2 years old. But Victoria's presence at the farm came with whispers of scandal. For years, townsfolk whispered about her relationship with her father, Andreas. Court records confirmed the rumors. Both father and daughter had once been charged with incest. Though Andreas had served prison time, Victoria had not. The scandal left a permanent stain on the family's reputation, and though Joseph was officially said to be the child of Victoria's late husband, many in the village suspected he was Andreas's son. Others pointed fingers at a neighbor, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, who had once courted Victoria. Joseph's paternity would remain one of many unanswered questions. So already, before the murders, Hinterkaifeck was a house clouded by tension and secrecy. Andreas ruled with severity. Victoria lived under suspicion and shame, and the children were caught in the middle, their lives framed by whispers. The farm itself carried its own unease. Hinterkaifeck was productive, yes, but it had an atmosphere that neighbors described as eerie. In the weeks leading up to the murders, that eeriness grew stronger. Strange events began to unfold. Snow fell heavily that March, and one morning Andreas discovered footprints leading from the forest directly to the farmhouse, but none leading back. Whoever had come, it seemed, had never left. Soon after, the family heard footsteps in the attic, scraping noises, faint voices, and a presence that no one could explain. When Andreas searched the attic, he found nothing. Keys went missing. A newspaper appeared on the property that no one in the family subscribed to. To the Sodders in America, it had been strangers and threats. To the Grubers in Bavaria, it was footsteps and whispers in the rafters. Both families lived with signs that something was wrong, but neither could interpret them until it was too late. Adding to the unease was the maid. The Grubers employed a housemaid named Maria, but she left her job weeks before the murders, claiming the farmhouse was haunted. She had heard footsteps in the attic, felt watched, and told neighbors she was terrified. Andreas dismissed her fears, but he soon hired a replacement, Maria Baumgartner, 44, who arrived at the farm on March 31st, 1922, the very day the murders took place. Maria's arrival should have been a new beginning for the household, a reset after weeks of fear. Instead, it placed her directly in the path of horror. Within hours, she would join the family in their fate. When you put these pieces together, the picture that emerges is of a household already on edge. A domineering father with a history of cruelty, a daughter shamed by scandal, children innocent but vulnerable, a maid who believed the place was haunted, footsteps in the attic, missing keys, strange newspapers. If this were a detective novel, the stage couldn't have been set more perfectly for disaster. And yet, unlike fiction, this wasn't the carefully designed plot of an author. This was real life, and the dread hanging over Hinterkaifeck wasn't foreshadowing, it was warning. And like so many warnings, it went unheeded. Because on March 31st, when night fell on the farmhouse, the shadows finally revealed themselves, not in whispers, not in footsteps, but in blood. March 31st, 1922. The Bavarian air was sharp with lingering snow. At Hinterkaifeck, night came as it always did, quietly, without neighbors nearby to hear or see what unfolded. Inside the farmhouse, 6 people moved about their final evening, though none could have known it. The new maid, Maria Baumgartner, had only just arrived that very day. Her sister had walked her to the farm, said goodbye, and left her to settle into her new life with the Grubers. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a safe position in a respectable household. By dawn, Maria would be dead. Inside, the family followed their routines. Andreas, the patriarch, likely tended to the animals before nightfall. His wife Cecilia busied herself in the kitchen. Victoria cared for her children, little Cecilia and 2-year-old Joseph. The atmosphere may have seemed calm, even ordinary, but a shadow was already crossing their threshold. At some point in the night, historians and detectives still debate the exact hour. Someone entered the barn. How they lured the first victim there is unknown. Perhaps they called out, perhaps the barking dog drew attention, perhaps the footsteps in the attic had finally emboldened themselves. But what happened next was swift, brutal, and precise. The first victim was Andreas Gruber, struck with a mattock, a heavy farming tool resembling a pickaxe. He collapsed in the hay. The killer wasted no time. Cecilia Senior followed, then Victoria, then the 7-year-old little Cecilia, each struck down one after the other. Some believe the family was lured out one by one into the barn, silenced before the others could suspect. The horror of that moment is magnified by one chilling detail. Evidence suggests little Cecilia survived her first blow. She was found later with clumps of her own hair torn out, as if she had lain in agony, pulling at her head before finally succumbing. Few details in crime files are more haunting than that. With 4 family members slain in the barn, the killer, or killers, moved into the house. There they found Joseph, asleep in his crib, and Maria, the maid, settling into her new quarters. Both were murdered with the same brutal efficiency. 6 victims in total. Then, as though the act itself were not strange enough, the killer covered the bodies. In the barn, hay was piled over Andreas, Cecilia, Victoria, and little Cecilia. In the house, blankets were drawn over Joseph and Maria. It wasn't concealment. The bodies were still visible. It was ritual, almost an act of respect, or shame. Killers don't cover victims unless something deeper stirs inside them. But what happened after the murders is even stranger. The killer didn't leave. For days they stayed at Hinterkaifeck. Neighbors reported seeing smoke rising from the farmhouse chimney. The animals were fed. Meals were cooked. Someone lived in that house with 6 corpses only a few feet away. The family dog, tied up in the barn, was released and cared for. The routine of the farm continued as though the Grubers had never died. Think about that for a moment. Whoever killed them didn't flee into the night. Panicked and bloody, they settled in, calmly inhabiting the house, carrying out chores, eating meals, stoking the fire, as if Hinterkaifeck now belonged to them. Days later, neighbors grew suspicious. The Grubers had not been seen in town. Little Cecilia and Joseph had not attended school or church. Mail piled up. Finally, on April 4th, neighbors entered the farm. What they found would become one of Germany's most infamous crime scenes. The sight was grotesque. In the barn, bodies lay partially hidden under hay, the ground darkened by dried blood. In the house, Joseph and Maria lay under blankets, their faces still as though they were sleeping. The silence of the farm, broken only by the barking of the family's loyal dog, pressed down on everyone who entered. Detectives who arrived were shaken not only by the brutality of the murders, but by the uncanny calm with which the aftermath was staged. The covered bodies, the tended animals, the smoke that neighbors had seen. Whoever had committed the murders had not only taken lives, they had stepped into them, lived them, if only for a few days. The night of March 31st remains a black hole in the Hinterkaifeck file. No one saw the killer arrive. No one heard the cries from the barn. The only witness, perhaps, was the child who pulled out her own hair in agony before death silenced her too. The evidence tells a story of cold precision, a weapon chosen from the farm itself, blows delivered with ruthless force, bodies arranged, house occupied. But the evidence does not tell us who or why. Every case file has two halves. One is the evidence, the footprints, the blood, the contradictions. The other is the people, the lives cut short, the voices silenced. To understand Hinterkaifeck, we have to remember not just how they died, but who they were. Andreas Gruber, the patriarch in shadows. At 63, Andreas Gruber was the kind of man who carried shadows in his wake. Neighbors described him as cold, unfriendly, a man who made enemies more easily than friends. He ruled the farm with a strict hand, and his reputation for cruelty extended beyond his household. In a community where everyone knew everyone else's business, Andreas was a figure both resented and feared. The incest charge with his daughter Victoria stained him permanently. He had served time, but whispers never died. Some claimed he was tyrannical at home, others that he was deeply paranoid. In the weeks before his death, he confided to neighbors about the strange events at the farm, the missing keys, the footsteps in the attic. But Andreas was the type to keep such fears close, never asking for help until it was too late. If anyone had enemies, Andreas surely did. Cecilia Gruber, the silent matriarch. At 72, Cecilia had spent her life bound to Andreas, enduring his temper and his dominance. Neighbors rarely spoke of her, except to say she seemed weary, withdrawn, the kind of woman who had grown accustomed to surviving in her husband's shadow. She worked tirelessly in the household, her role defined by tradition and endurance. On the night of the murders, she was one of the first to fall in the barn. Her death, while brutal, almost feels inevitable in the dark orbit of her husband's life. Yet she too was a victim not only of the crime, but of a life lived under silence. Victoria Gabriel, the daughter stained by rumor. Victoria was 35, a widow whose husband had been killed in World War I. She had returned to the farm with her two children, little Cecilia and Joseph, hoping for stability. Instead, she became the subject of relentless gossip. Her incestuous relationship with her father had been dragged into the courts, her name permanently tied to scandal. Many believed her son Joseph was Andreas's child, though others suspected her neighbor, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, with whom she had once had a relationship. Despite the whispers, Victoria was known for her kindness in the village. She sang in the church choir and was described as warm and devout. Her life was one of contradictions, loved by some, shamed by others, forever caught between her father's control and the community's judgment. When she was murdered in the barn, she was killed alongside her daughter, as though even in death scandal and innocence were bound together. Little Cecilia, a child's final struggle. At 7 years old, little Cecilia embodied innocence caught in the crossfire of shadows she could never understand. Teachers described her as bright and lively, her presence in school a welcome light. Her death is perhaps the most haunting detail of the case. She was not killed instantly. Evidence showed she survived long enough to suffer, pulling clumps of her own hair out in agony before dying. That image has haunted investigators for over a century. In every file there are details that refuse to fade. For Hinterkaifeck, it is this: a child, struck down in a barn, fighting for life, her small hands tugging at her own hair as the world went black. Joseph, the child of mystery. 2 years old, barely more than a baby. Joseph had become the subject of speculation before he could even speak. Was he the son of Victoria's late husband, of Andreas, her father, or of Lorenz Schlittenbauer, her neighbor and one-time lover? Joseph's existence was an open question in the village, a question whispered about in taverns and church pews. His short life was defined less by who he was than by what people believed about him, and in death, that question lingered, unsolved, like the murders themselves. He was killed in his crib, the smallest, most defenseless victim in a case already steeped in cruelty. Maria Baumgartner, the unlucky maid. 44 years old, Maria had just arrived at Hinterkaifeck the day of the murders. Her predecessor had quit weeks earlier, claiming the farmhouse was haunted. Maria had no way of knowing she was walking into her death. Her sister escorted her to the farm, said goodbye, and left her there. A simple domestic arrangement, one that should have brought stability and income. Instead, within hours, Maria was dead in her room, struck down by the same weapon that claimed the family. Of all the victims, Maria was the least tied to the farm's tensions and scandals. She was simply in the wrong place, at the wrong time, a reminder that some victims aren't part of the mystery. They're just swallowed by it. 6 lives, 6 silences. Together, these 6 formed the human side of the Hinterkaifeck tragedy. Andreas, the harsh patriarch. Cecilia, the weary matriarch. Victoria, the daughter trapped by scandal. Little Cecilia, innocence lost in agony. Joseph, the child of uncertain blood. Maria, the maid caught in the wrong story. 6 lives ended in one night. 6 silences that still echo. The victims of Hinterkaifeck weren't strangers or footnotes. They were people with loves, flaws, scandals, and struggles, and their deaths didn't just erase them. They left behind a void, a set of unanswered questions that transformed a farmhouse murder into one of history's most enduring mysteries. In every great mystery, there are warning signs. Whispers in the dark, puzzles left unsolved, shadows creeping before the storm. At Hinterkaifeck, the murders didn't come out of nowhere. For weeks, perhaps months, something had been stirring on that isolated farm, something that made even hardened villagers uneasy. Footsteps in the snow. It began with footprints, not just any footprints, but a trail of them, leading from the woods to the farmhouse. They were crisp, clear in the snow, each one a human step pressing toward the Gruber family's home. And then, nothing. No trail leading back out. Whoever had walked toward Hinterkaifeck had not walked away. When Andreas Gruber found those tracks, he knew what they meant. He wasn't a superstitious man, but he was a farmer, and farmers trust their land. Something was wrong. He told neighbors about it, his voice grave, his suspicion clear, but no one followed the prints. No one investigated. In hindsight, it was the first sign of something watching the farm. Noises in the attic. A few days later, Andreas heard noises above his head, shuffling sounds. Footsteps, the creak of boards under unseen weight. He checked the attic. Nothing. He dismissed it at first, blaming rats or settling wood, but the noises came back, again and again, as if someone lived above them, breathing with the family, listening to their every move. The idea that someone could have been living in the farmhouse attic, eating scraps, moving at night, watching, is one of the most chilling theories of the case. Imagine it, an intruder within the walls, biding their time, waiting. A key goes missing. Then, there was the key. One day, Andreas discovered that one of the house keys had vanished. Not misplaced. Vanished. No one admitted to moving it. No one claimed responsibility. In a household already tense with scandal, a missing key was no small thing. It meant either someone inside the home had hidden it, or someone outside had taken it. Either way, the farmhouse no longer felt secure. Doors meant to keep danger out may have been opened from within. The newspaper that shouldn't exist. Weeks before the murders, Andreas found a newspaper in the house. Nothing unusual in that, except this was a newspaper from a nearby town, one the Grubers had no reason to buy. No one in the family admitted to bringing it home. The presence of the paper sparked paranoia. Did a stranger leave it there? Was it a taunt? A reminder that someone else was inside their home? For Andreas, it was another sign that something unseen had breached the farm. The maid who fled. Perhaps the most telling clue of all came not from the family, but from their maid. The woman who had served the Grubers before Maria, the new maid, suddenly quit her position. She told neighbors the farm was haunted. She claimed she heard footsteps, voices, and movements in rooms that should have been empty. She felt watched, oppressed by something she couldn't name. The Grubers dismissed her complaints, but when she left, the farmhouse grew even more isolated. On the very day Maria Baumgartner replaced her, the murders began. Dogs barking at nothing. The Gruber's dog, a loyal farm animal, began barking late into the nights before the murders. Neighbors could hear it, sharp and insistent, the sound carrying across the fields. Farmers know their animals. They don't bark at shadows for no reason. Whatever stirred the dog kept it agitated, restless, warning its masters in a language they didn't understand. If only they had listened. Andreas sips uneasy confessions. Despite his stern reputation, Andreas did speak about these events. He told neighbors of the footsteps, the attic noises, the missing key. Some took him seriously. Others brushed it off as paranoia. After all, Andreas wasn't well liked. A man known for his cruelty wasn't someone people rushed to protect. Still, he told them, the warnings were spoken aloud, the signs were clear, yet no one acted. The foreshadowing of doom. Looking back, these clues form a grim picture. Footprints, attic noises, a missing key, a strange newspaper, a maid fleeing in terror, a dog barking into the void, a patriarch whispering unease. It was as if the farmhouse itself was screaming for help, signaling that something was deeply wrong, and still, life went on. The cattle were fed, the wood was chopped, the family attended church, sang hymns, played their roles, until one night, everything came crashing down in the barn. In mysteries, hindsight is the cruelest detective. It tells us what we should have seen, what we might have stopped. The Gruber's story is drenched in hindsight. The warnings were there, the clues were plain, yet the farmhouse stood silent, waiting for the killer who had already moved inside its walls. By late March, 1922, Hinterkaifeck was heavy with unease. Footsteps in the snow, attic noises, missing keys, and a maid who fled in terror. These weren't just oddities, they were omens. Still, life on the farm pressed forward, as it always did. And then came the night when the farmhouse fell silent forever. The last known moments. On March 31st, the family followed their ordinary evening routine. Jazilia Jr. walked home from school. Andreas split wood in the yard. Victoria fed the livestock. Joseph, the youngest, toddled at his mother's side. Maria, the new maid, tried to settle into her first night at Hinterkaifeck, unaware that she had stepped into a nightmare. The evening seemed normal enough, but sometime after nightfall, the killer made their move. The barn as the stage. Investigators pieced together what likely happened from the gruesome aftermath. One by one, the family members were lured into the barn. Perhaps they heard a noise among the cattle. Perhaps they were tricked, called outside by the killer. One by one, they walked into the dark. The barn was the perfect killing ground. Its doors muffled sound, its hay mounds absorbed screams, and the livestock stood as silent witnesses. Andreas Gruber, the first to fall. The patriarch was likely the first victim. Andreas was no fool. He wouldn't have entered the barn without reason. Maybe he thought he was checking on the cattle, or confronting a trespasser. But the killer struck quickly and brutally, wielding a mattock, a heavy farming tool with a blade sharp enough to split bone. Andreas's skull was crushed in the shadows of his own barn. He fell in the straw, the old tyrant silenced forever. Cecilia Gruber, the next to enter. Cecilia, his wife, came searching. Perhaps she wondered what had kept her husband so long. She stepped into the barn calling his name. The killer was waiting. The mattock came down again. Cecilia collapsed beside Andreas, her final breath merging with the hay dust air. Victoria Gabriel, a daughter sips fate. Victoria's death may have been the most tragic, already scarred by scandal, already crushed beneath her father's domination. She entered the barn searching for her parents. The killer struck her down in the same fashion, but investigators noted something unusual. Victoria appeared to have fought back, bruises, torn clothing, defensive wounds. She resisted. If so, her final act was defiance. But resistance was futile. The mattock won. Little Cecilia, the child witness. The most haunting victim was little Cecilia, just 7 years old. She must have walked in after hearing the commotion. She saw the bodies of her parents and grandparents. Imagine the terror in her small chest as she realized what she had stepped into. The killer did not spare her. She too was struck down. But evidence showed something chilling. She survived the initial blow. Investigators found strands of her hair, torn out by her own hand. In agony she had lived long enough to pull her hair before death claimed her. Her suffering lingers as one of the most heart-wrenching details of Hinterkaifeck. Joseph and Maria, murder in the house. With the family in the barn silenced, the killer turned to the house. Inside, 2 more lives waited. Maria Baumgartner, the maid, was killed in her bedchamber. It was her first night on the farm. Her fate was sealed the moment she arrived. Then came Yosef, the baby, less than 2 years old, sleeping in his crib. The killer delivered the same merciless blow, leaving no witness alive. The aftermath in silence. By dawn, 6 lives had been taken. The Gruber family and their maid lay dead, their blood seeping into straw, sheets and wood. But the farmhouse did not fall silent just yet. For days afterward, smoke curled from the chimney. Cattle were fed. Food was cooked. The dog barked from the barn. Someone, the killer, or killers, remained at Hinterkaifeck, living among the corpses, keeping up the illusion of life. This detail is one of the most terrifying in the case. Whoever committed the murders did not simply kill and flee. They stayed, slept in the beds, ate at the table, tended the animals, as if the farm was theirs now, as if they had always belonged there. Discovery of the horror. Days later, neighbors grew suspicious. No one had seen the family. Little Cecilia had missed school. The Grubers hadn't shown at church. A repairman who came to the farm was greeted only by silence. Finally, concerned neighbors entered the property. They pushed open the barn doors and found the scene. The family piled atop one another, their bodies covered in hay. Inside the house, Maria and Josef lay dead. The gruesome discovery shocked the village, and what stunned investigators most was not just the brutality, but the precision. This was no crime of passion. It was systematic, controlled, almost ritualistic. The farm becomes a legend. With 6 dead, no suspects in custody, and a village terrified, Hinterkaifeck ceased to be a farm. It became a legend, a place people whispered about, a story parents told their children to scare them at night. The farmhouse, with its footprints, missing keys, attic noises, and bloody barn, was no longer a home. It was a riddle carved into wood and earth. By the time Hinterkaifeck revealed its horrors, the family had been dead for several days. What unsettled everyone most was not only the massacre itself, but the time that had passed before anyone dared to check. A village grows uneasy. The Grubers weren't exactly popular. Andreas was domineering. Victoria lived under scandal, and the farm sat isolated nearly a kilometre from the nearest neighbours. Still, in a small Bavarian community, absences don't go unnoticed. By Sunday, April 2nd, alarms quietly rang. Little Cecilia had not shown up at school for days. The family had missed church services, a weekly routine the villagers could set their clocks to. The mailman noticed something odd, letters piling up uncollected. A repairman, who had come to fix a machine, reported no one answered his calls at the house. And yet, smoke had been seen rising from the chimney. Animals were fed. The dog barked from the barn. To the villagers, it seemed the Grubers were there, but avoiding everyone, suspicion grew too thick to ignore. The grim discovery in the barn. On April 4th, neighbors finally decided to enter the property. Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a local farmer with his own tangled history with Victoria, led the group. They approached the barn first. At first glance, all was quiet. The cattle shifted nervously in their stalls. A faint smell lingered in the hay. Then they saw it, a pile of straw, oddly arranged, almost deliberate. When they moved the straw aside, horror struck. Beneath lay Andreas, Cecilia, Victoria, and little Cecilia, their bodies stacked as though discarded, hay covering their bloodied faces. Each bore the same brutal wounds, skulls caved in, faces shattered, the work of a mattock. The discovery silenced the group. What they saw was not just murder, but a calculated massacre. Inside the house, 2 more victims. With dread rising, the neighbors entered the farmhouse itself. Inside, silence hung heavy. In one bedroom, they found Maria Baumgartner, the maid, struck dead on her first night at Hinterkaifeck. Then, in the nursery, they found Joseph. The toddler's life had ended before it truly began. Struck while he slept, his crib had become his coffin. 6 victims in total. A whole household erased. Investigators arrive and fumble. Word spread quickly. Soon, police descended on the farm. But in 1922, rural Bavaria, forensics was far from modern standards. The crime scene was compromised almost immediately. Neighbors and curious villagers had already trampled through the house and barn, contaminating evidence. Items were moved, touched, and even stolen. Investigators later admitted that crucial details might have been forever lost in those chaotic first hours. Still, they began their work. unsettling crime scene details. Certain discoveries stood out. Hay coverings. The bodies in the barn had been carefully covered with straw and planks, as though the killer wished to hide their work, or perhaps grant the victims a twisted form of respect. The attic. Signs suggested someone had been living in the attic before the murders. Food scraps and disturbed hay hinted at a hidden occupant. The chimney smoke. Neighbors reported smoke from the farmhouse chimney even after the estimated time of death, suggesting the killer had lingered, cooking meals, tending livestock, even sleeping in the house alongside the corpses. Joseph's death. The brutality spared no one. The presence of the infant among the dead raised chilling questions. Had the killer seen him as an innocent, or as a symbol, an unwanted child tied to scandal? Initial suspicions. Suspicion immediately fell on those close to the Grubers. At the forefront was Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the very man who had led neighbors to the scene. His history with Victoria, rumored intimacy, a disputed paternity claim over Joseph, made him an obvious suspect. When questioned, Lorenz behaved strangely. He showed little emotion upon seeing the bodies. He even handled the corpses, moving straw aside with his bare hands. To villagers, his coldness was chilling. Some whispered that he knew too much, too quickly. Yet no evidence tied him directly to the killings. The case of the missing money. Curiously, investigators noted that money and valuables were left untouched in the house. Robbery was not the motive. Whoever killed the Grubers was not there for wealth. This fact fueled theories: personal vengeance, family scandal, or some deep hidden grudge. Clumsy forensics, endless questions. In an age before DNA testing, investigators relied on fingerprints, witness accounts, and motive. The farm, however, yielded little in the way of answers. The footprints in the snow, leading toward the farm but not away, were real, but the weather had erased them by the time police arrived. Missing keys were noted, but never found. The attic noises remained speculation. What was certain, the murders had been deliberate, systematic, and unhurried. The farm transforms into a crime scene museum. In the weeks following the discovery, Hinterkaifeck drew crowds. Locals came to gawk. Journalists wrote lurid reports. Even strangers from other towns visited, treating the farm like a grim spectacle. To investigators, this was a nightmare. Every new footprint, every shifted object, further muddled the crime scene. The farm ceased to be a private tragedy. It became a public obsession. A village in fear. Fear gripped the villagers. If such horror could happen to the Grubers, it could happen to anyone. Farmers began locking their doors at night. Children whispered about the murderer hiding in the woods. The idea that the killer had lived in the attic, listening as the family went about their daily lives, haunted everyone. Whoever committed the murders had shown patience, stealth, and ruthlessness, and worst of all, they had never been caught. Legacy of the discovery. The initial investigation left more questions than answers. Was the killer an outsider, passing through, a family member with buried rage, a spurned lover, or perhaps, as some villagers whispered, something darker, a curse, or evil itself, rooted in the soil of Hinterkaifeck? The farmhouse, once just another Bavarian homestead, had transformed overnight into the stage for one of history's most haunting unsolved mysteries, and though investigators left with notes, sketches, and theories, they did not leave with justice. Hinterkaifeck's secrets remained buried in the barn straw. The Hinterkaifeck murders quickly spiraled into one of the most perplexing criminal investigations in European history. With no money stolen, no clear escape route, and eerie signs that the killer may have stayed on the farm after the massacre, investigators had to ask the most haunting question of all: who would kill 6 people with such brutality, and why? Suspect #1. Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbor with a motive. Lorenz was the first suspect in the eyes of many villagers. His history with Victoria was complicated, to say the least. The two had reportedly been romantically involved, and some claimed Lorenz was even the biological father of little Joseph. The Grubers, however, publicly dismissed Lorenz's claim of paternity, humiliating him and leaving him bitter. When the murders occurred, Lorenz was one of the first to discover the bodies. Witnesses reported his strange behavior. He moved the corpses without hesitation, seemed oddly calm, and even led others through the house like he knew what to expect. Some argued he staged his involvement as a cover-up, helping investigate his own crime to avoid suspicion. Yet no forensic evidence tied him directly to the killings. Was he guilty, or just unlucky enough to fit the profile of a scorned neighbor? Suspect #2. Carl Gabriel, the husband who never returned. Victoria's husband, Carl Gabriel, had supposedly died in World War I in 1914, yet whispers spread that he might have faked his death or returned years later. This theory was fueled by stories of Victoria speaking of Carl as if he were alive, and sightings of strange men in the area. If Carl had returned, bitter over Victoria's rumoured affairs and the questionable paternity of Joseph, could he have carried out revenge? The problem with this theory was simple: no solid evidence. Carl's death was confirmed by military reports. Still, the idea of the ghost husband stalking back into Victoria's life added fuel to the mystery. Suspect #3. The Gruber family itself, a household of secrets. The Gruber household was not a peaceful one. Andreas Gruber, the patriarch, had a notorious reputation. He was harsh, domineering, and most disturbingly, there were allegations of incest between him and Victoria. Court records from 1915 showed both father and daughter were convicted of an incestuous relationship, serving prison time for it. By 1922, rumours suggested this relationship may have resumed. If true, Joseph's paternity may not have been Lorenz's or Carl's, but Andreas's. The scandal was so deep that some theorized one of the family members, perhaps even Victoria herself, lashed out violently to end the torment. But this theory failed for one reason: all family members were among the dead, unless someone within survived longer and staged the scene, which investigators found no proof of. The inside job theory faltered. Suspect #4, outsiders, vagabonds, or soldiers. Another possibility was that the murders were carried out by strangers passing through. Germany in the early 1920s was a nation in chaos. The aftermath of World War I had left countless men displaced, homeless, and hardened by violence. Bandits and drifters roamed rural areas, committing robberies and murders. However, the killer had lingered on the farm, feeding animals and cooking meals. Such behavior suggested familiarity with the home and the family. Would an outsider truly stay among the corpses for days? Suspect #5, revenge by a wronged enemy. Andreas Gruber was not well liked. He had quarreled with neighbours, employers, and even distant relatives. Some villagers thought the murders were an act of revenge, carried out by someone with a deep grudge against Andreas. If so, the brutality made sense: smashing skulls with a mattock, killing even the children, covering the bodies as though tidying up a mess. But who held such hatred? And why leave valuables untouched, when robbery could have easily masked the true motive? Suspect #6, the mysterious attic resident. Perhaps the most unsettling theory came from the unexplained signs of an attic intruder, the noises the family reported before the murders, the missing house keys, the footprints leading into the farm but never leaving, all pointed to someone hiding within the walls of Hinterkaifeck. Had the killer been living among them for days, watching their routines, waiting for the right moment to strike? If so, was this person a stranger, or someone close enough to move through the farm unnoticed? Theories, twists, and dead ends. Over time, police investigated dozens of suspects, from petty criminals to war deserters, to neighbors with feuds. The list grew, yet evidence never stuck. Witnesses contradicted each other, alibis held firm, and the trail went cold. Forensic science at the time was too primitive to extract clear conclusions. Fingerprints were smudged, footprints faded, and any chance of identifying the killer slipped away with each passing day. Modern re-examinations. Decades later, criminologists and historians revisited the case. Modern profiling suggested the killer likely knew the family well. They displayed control, patience, and personal hatred. Some experts argue the evidence still points back to Lorenz Schlittenbauer, while others maintain it could have been a family scandal that finally erupted in violence. But without DNA, and with all key suspects long dead, the truth may never be known. Why the suspects matter? The theories do more than identify potential killers. They reveal the dark underbelly of Hinterkaifeck. Whether through incestuous scandal, bitter rivalries, or the spectre of war, the Grubers were surrounded by secrets and enemies. Their farmhouse was more than a home. It was a crucible of tension, waiting to explode. The unsolved nature of the suspects doesn't just keep the case alive, it transforms Hinterkaifeck into something more than a murder mystery. It becomes a mirror reflecting human cruelty, silence, and suspicion. The lingering fear. Every suspect, every theory, pointed to one truth. The killer was someone capable of intimate violence, of cruelty without mercy. And worst of all, they were never caught. For the villagers of 1922, that meant the murderer could still be among them. A man nodding politely in the street, a farmer working the fields, a neighbor sipping beer at the tavern. Perhaps the murderer carried on with life, never confessing, never punished. And for us today, it means the case remains frozen in that chilling uncertainty. Hinterkaifeck's theories don't solve the crime, but they keep the story alive. When the 6 bodies of the Gruber family and young maid Maria were lowered into their graves, the village of Kaifeck did not breathe a sigh of relief. If anything, the fear grew thicker. 6 lives had been butchered in a farmhouse that stood just a short walk from their homes, and the killer had vanished into thin air. The sense of safety in this rural Bavarian community was shattered, replaced by suspicion, whispers, and the lingering terror that evil was not a shadowy figure from afar, but a face they might already know. The village in shock. In the immediate days after the discovery, villagers refused to walk alone after dark. Farmers kept their families indoors, bolting doors and windows, as if wood and iron could hold back something inhuman. The taverns that once filled with laughter and chatter, now echoed with subdued voices, as men swapped theories in hushed tones over beer. Every neighbor looked at the other with quiet suspicion. Who among them was capable of something so monstrous? Even children sensed the dread. Parents warned them never to stray near the farm. The Gruber land, once just another farmstead among many, became a cursed landmark, a scar on the countryside. The funeral and rumors. The funeral drew villagers from near and far, all standing in stunned silence. 6 coffins, side by side, represented not just the victims but the destruction of an entire household line. The priest spoke of God's justice and eternal rest, yet his words did little to comfort those who knew the killer was still out there. In the weeks after, gossip mixed with grief. Some swore they had seen shadowy figures wandering the fields at night. Others claimed the Grubers were cursed, punished by God for sins whispered about in the village for years. The incest allegations, the paternity rumors, and the bitter feuds resurfaced, rebranded as reasons for divine retribution. But even the most superstitious agreed on one thing: no curse could wield a mattock with such brutal precision. There was a human hand behind it, and that was far more terrifying. The fate of the farm. The Hinterkaifeck farmhouse could not simply return to ordinary use. For months it stood abandoned, a grim reminder. Every time villagers passed by, people avoided even looking at it, as though the sight alone could summon nightmares. Eventually the farm was auctioned off, but even new ownership could not wash away the bloodstains. The land was cultivated again, but the house carried too much weight of death and dread. Years later, it was demolished, the earth swallowing the foundations as if eager to hide the shame. Today, only a monument stands where the farmhouse once did. Visitors leave flowers, notes, and sometimes strange tokens, symbols of how the case still haunts imaginations. The investigators and their failure. For police and authorities, the case was both an obsession and an embarrassment. Despite questioning dozens of suspects, retracing the events, and even using what little forensic methods they had at the time, no charges ever stuck. The more they investigated, the murkier the picture became. Evidence was contaminated early on, with curious villagers trampling the scene and even children playing near the bodies before officials secured the farm. Vital clues slipped away in those first chaotic hours, ensuring the case would remain forever unsolved. For decades, local police occasionally revisited the murders. Files were reopened, suspects re-examined, but always the trail led back to shadows. In later years, criminology students and experts tried to apply modern profiling. Many became convinced the killer was someone close, possibly Lorenz Schlittenbauer, but without DNA or solid proof, suspicion could never become certainty. The lasting fear. For the villagers, life resumed, but never the same. Hinterkaifeck was a constant reminder of fragility, of how even in their isolated farmland lives, violence could erupt without warning. Some villagers claimed to hear strange noises when passing the site at night. Whispers carried on the wind, the clink of unseen footsteps, or the cry of animals. Rational minds dismissed this as imagination fueled by fear, but in Kaifeck, imagination and fear had become inseparable. Parents used the murders as warnings to their children. Stay close, don't wander, evil hides in silence. The case becomes legend. As years turned to decades, the story of Hinterkaifeck spread beyond Bavaria. Newspapers sensationalized it. Writers used it as fodder for crime novels, and ghost story enthusiasts wove it into local folklore. The details, the footprints, The attic noises, the feeding of animals seemed too bizarre to be real, and yet they were. The farm became more than a crime scene. It became a stage upon which the darkest fears of rural life played out. Isolation, secrecy, and violence collided, creating a story so chilling it refused to fade. A haunted memory for generations. Even a century later, the case carries weight. Locals in the region still tell the story, often with a mixture of shame and fascination. The murders remain a stain on the history of Upper Bavaria, one that families in the area inherit like an unwanted heirloom. Descendants of those who lived nearby still debate who the killer might have been. Some carry theories passed down like family recipes, each retelling slightly altered, but always echoing the same chilling mystery. Why it still matters. The aftermath of Hinterkaifeck proves that unsolved crimes never die. Without resolution, they linger like a wound that refuses to close. For the victims, justice never came. For the village, trust was shattered. For the wider world, it became a story that bridges the gap between true crime and legend, fact and folklore. The farm may be gone, the suspects long dead, but the sense of unease remains timeless. Perhaps that is why the story still grips us. It asks not only who killed the Grubers, but what darkness lives inside human nature, and how close it might be to our own doorstep. The shadow that remains. In the end, the most frightening part of Hinterkaifeck is not the 6 bodies or the brutal weapon. It is the silence that followed. A silence that spread through the village, seeped into history, and still echoes today. Because the murderer was never caught, the story never ended. And perhaps that is why, 100 years later, we are still here, piecing together footprints in the snow, listening for creaks in the attic, and wondering if evil sometimes lives closer than we think. The Hinterkaifeck murders did not end in 1922. The Gruber family's deaths became seeds that sprouted through the soil of German folklore, criminology, and modern true crime fascination. Unlike so many other tragedies that fade with time, this one remained, stubborn, unsolved, and chillingly vivid. The story of that lonely farm and its secrets continues to echo across books, films, and late-night conversations, proving that sometimes the most enduring stories are the ones without endings. A century of fascination. In the decades following the murders, newspapers revisited Hinterkaifeck regularly, particularly on anniversaries of the crime. Each retelling introduced the case to a new generation of readers, and with each version came speculation: who was the killer? What motive could explain such savagery? Unlike urban crimes, this one carried the mystique of isolation. The idea of a farmhouse cut off from the world, where whispers in the attic could become deadly, fed the public imagination. It was not just a murder story, it was a gothic rural mystery, and that made it unforgettable. By the mid-20th century, crime historians were studying Hinterkaifeck, not only for its brutality, but also for what it revealed about policing failures, forensic limitations, and village psychology. It became a case study in what happens when a community is consumed by suspicion, but never given closure. The rise of true crime media. As the true crime genre exploded in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, Hinterkaifeck found itself reborn. Documentaries, podcasts, and YouTube channels poured over the details, revisiting suspects like Lorenz Schlittenbauer and speculating on the eerie signs, the footprints, the attic noises, the animals fed by the killer. Podcasts in particular embraced the story. With its eerie farmhouse setting and its unresolved ending, it was tailor-made for audio storytelling. The creak of footsteps, the whisper of wind through the rafters, the silence of a killer slipping away. For many listeners around the world, Hinterkaifeck became their first brush with German true crime. True crime television followed, often dramatizing the story with shadowy reenactments, a narrator's hushed tone, and lingering shots of snow-covered farm fields. Each adaptation added to the legend, even as none could solve it. In literature and fiction, writers could not resist Hinterkaifeck either. From crime novels loosely inspired by the case to historical accounts aiming for accuracy, the farmhouse became a backdrop where fact and fiction blurred. German authors produced chilling retellings, while international writers wove the murders into broader explorations of evil, superstition, and isolation. The case became a ghost story in some circles, a cautionary tale in others. Even when fictionalized, the heart of the story, a family wiped out, a killer never caught, always remained intact. Cultural symbolism. Hinterkaifeck is more than a story of murder. It has become a cultural symbol, representing several things at once. The fragility of rural life, how even in tight-knit communities violence can erupt from within. The limits of justice, how police can fail, how evidence can vanish, and how killers can outlive the law. The haunting of memory, how a place can carry trauma so strong it reshapes the identity of a whole village. For Germans, it is a story embedded in local identity, both shameful and captivating. For the wider world, it is a reminder that evil does not only lurk in crowded cities, but can thrive in the quiet of the countryside. Modern investigations and theories. Even in recent years, Hinterkaifeck continues to draw attention from amateur sleuths and forensic enthusiasts. Online forums dissect every detail, creating elaborate timelines, maps, and suspect profiles. Some claim new insights from digital analysis of old files. Others argue passionately for or against the Lorenz theory. In 2007, students at a German police academy attempted to apply modern criminological techniques. Their conclusion? That the most likely suspect was indeed Lorenz Schlittenbauer. Yet even their careful review could not provide proof. Like every investigation before, it ended with more questions than answers. This inability to resolve the case has only deepened its myth. The killer, whether dead long ago or hidden behind a neighbor's face, remains untouchable. The case in popular consciousness. Today, Hinterkaifeck lives on as a staple of true crime lists. Top 10 Unsolved Murders, Creepiest Crimes of the 20th Century, Germany's Darkest Secrets. Each retelling cements it further as one of the great mysteries. YouTube creators, much like we are doing now, craft long-form explorations of the case, blending storytelling with detective analysis. Podcasts revisit it, Netflix-style documentaries dramatize it, and crime conventions discuss it as a landmark case in forensic failure. And always, behind the fascination, lies unease, because if a killer could hide for days in a farmhouse, feed livestock, and slaughter a family without being caught, then perhaps evil is not only lurking, but patient. Why it endures. So why does the Hinterkaifeck story endure when so many other murders have been forgotten? The answer lies in its paradox. It is both ordinary and extraordinary. At its heart, it is about a family, their maid, and a farm, the most mundane of rural details. Yet wrapped around those details are footprints in the snow, noises in the attic, and an unseen hand wielding a mattock with precision. It is a story that feels at once human and ghostly, a killer who might have been a jealous neighbor, or perhaps something darker, a family torn apart not just by death, but by suspicion and silence. It lingers because it is unsolvable, and in unsolved mysteries, the imagination takes over. Closing reflection. 100 years have passed since Hinterkaifeck. The farmhouse is gone, reduced to memory and a monument. The villagers who whispered in fear are long dead. Even the suspects, guilty or not, have passed into the soil. And yet the story lives on, not only in Germany but worldwide. It appears in podcasts, videos, books, and conversations between strangers who lean in closer when they hear the words unsolved murder. Hinterkaifeck has become timeless. A murder case turned folklore, a tragedy turned lesson, and a secret that refuses to stay buried. The legacy of Hinterkaifeck is this: justice was never done, but memory never died, and in that, the Grubers remain with us, their silent farmhouse echoing through true crime history, a reminder that sometimes the scariest mysteries are the ones no one can solve.